A glorious good afternoon to each and every one of you. I know everybody's probably at work and won't get to see this until after they come home, but be that as it may, I'm gonna start off. Well, I'm gonna continue with chapter 8 of the unwhitewashed version of Black History. But before I get started, as always, please, folks, do not doubt that a small group of thoughtful, concerned, committed citizens can change the world, because that is the only thing that ever has. So make your calls. I know it looks crazy out here right now, but you just keep on citizening and calling your reps at the local, state, and federal levels. Let them know we ain't having it. So that being said, let me pick up with chapter 8. This is one of the shorter chapters in this book. So it is titled Construction. In describing the nation's post-Civil War era, the bloodshed by innocent black victims of white terrorism often becomes the focal point in the retelling of black history. For the first time since the inept English search for jewel fruit trees on the Virginia shore, the white men imagined a world that did not belong to them. Dispossessed of their human property, their wealth, and their honor, the planters and the poor Confederates were left only with the solidarity of their skin. Quote, he turned, therefore, from war service to guerrilla warfare, particularly against Negroes, end quote, Du Bois wrote. Quote, he joined eagerly secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which fed his vanity by making him a co-worker with the white planter and gave him a chance to maintain his race superiority by killing and intimidating, quote, niggers, end quote. And even in secret forays of his own, he could drive away the planter's black help, leaving the land open to white labor. Or he could murder 2 successful freedmen. And that's TOO, not one, not the number. But that is what they did to us, not what we did. After the Great War for white supremacy, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. This black America, conceived in their hearts and built by their unchained hands, was at once the paramount dream of the ex-slave and the ultimate realization of every white Southerner's fears. At the Negro's feet lay a tattered and smoldering South, yet ripe with the fruit of liberty and unending opportunity, ready to be redefined. The short poem, Land of the Thief, Home of the Slave. Mother's children seize a hard time when their mama's gone. Mother's children seize a hard time when their mama's gone. Lord, why do you make this world so cold? They ain't got no place to go. Motherless children seize a hard time when their mama's gone. If ever there was a metaphor for America, it is the story of the estate located at the intersection of the Ashley River, Wappo Creek, and the Stono River. When William Wallace McLeod purchased the estate in 1851, he had no idea that his new asset was already one of the most important plots of land in the history of America. The McLeod plantation was on James Island, South Carolina, just outside Charleston, a short walk from where Jimmy started the Stono Rebellion in 1739. He served as the base for the black pioneers during the siege of Charleston in the American Revolution. According to slave schedules, between 1851 and 1865, McLeod forced 95 different human beings to work 6 days a week on the new property, roughly the size of the Harlem section of Manhattan, and violence was necessary. After buying his new slice of earth for enslavement, Mr. McLeod transformed his new land into a producer of South Carolina's most lucrative product, Sea Island cotton. Unlike the more common varieties, Sea Island cotton can grow on stalks up to 6 feet tall, producing flowers as large as the human fist, with long, sturdy cotton fibers akin to the expensive Egyptian variety. McLeod had never grown cotton before, but he owned Pompey Dawson, an enslaved man known for singing his favorite Negro spirit. Quote, motherless children seize a hard time, end quote. He bellowed it as he worked in the marsh tending cotton until he became known as Hard Time Dawson. Although he had been enslaved for all of his life, Hard Time was one of America's foremost Sea Island cotton specialists. Bolstered by Hard Time's intellectual property, McLeod's farm became one of the most prosperous forced labor enterprises in South Carolina. While it was just the fifth largest plantation on James Island in acreage, it ranked third in the value of livestock, second in the value of its produce harvest, and first in Sea Island's cotton production. Hardtime was married with 4 children, the oldest of whom was William Dawson, who likely marched to the McLeod plantation blindfolded and barefoot, like most of the human beings McLeod purchased from Charleston Harbor, the country's busiest slave trading port. Will's feet never recovered, and he walked with a limp all of his life. But he inherited his father's knowledge of Sea Island cotton and was expected to carry on his father's legacy so that he could produce generational wealth for the McLeod family. When the Civil War's first shots were fired across the river from the McLeod plantation, William McLeod brought in his brother to run the farm. He moved his family to a vacation home in Greenwood, South Carolina, and volunteered for active duty with the Charleston Light Dragoons, the Confederate Army unit so elite it was known as the Sons of Privilege. Before he left to fight for his right to protect his slave camp, he leased a few of his slaves to the Confederate Army. Little did he know that they would not be the last black people from the McLeod plantation to serve in the Civil War. 40 acres and a mule. Although Reconstruction is generally considered to be the period after the Civil War, it began as early as 1862, when Confederate forces had suffered mounting losses and Lincoln began establishing provisional governments in conquered Confederate territories. As soon as Union Navy ships appeared across the river from the McLeod plantation in 1862, 9 of the individuals who were enslaved were emancipated. 9 of the individuals who were enslaved there emancipated themselves. 3 weeks later, another captive fled slavery. No one knows what happened to the original 9 Africans who absconded from the McLeod plantation. However, because of military records, we do know what happened to the 10. On May 25th, 1862, a black crew member volunteered on the USS Pembina, a Union Navy gunboat patrolling the intersection of the Ashley River, the Wapoo Creek, and the Stono River. He proved himself an invaluable navigator and served aboard the ship USS Wabash, a Union steam frigate, until October 1865. His name was William McLeod Dawson, the son of Hard Time. Unlike the owner of the McLeod plantation, by fighting for his country, Will immediately became acknowledged as an American citizen. By collectively deciding to kill their countrymen in order to continue the 200-year tradition of terrorizing and owning black people, the Confederates had formally renounced their citizenship to become citizens of the Confederate States of America. McLeod and others were now traitors in their own land. Post-secession, in order to restore the Union he promised to keep intact, Lincoln had to decide how he could create a path to regaining citizenship for the Southern turncoats. The radical Republicans proposed the Wade-Davis bill, which said that in order for a state to be readmitted to the Union, it would need to institute a ban on slavery in its constitution and have a majority of its voters take an oath of allegiance. Yet after the Wade-Davis bill passed the House and the Senate, Lincoln refused to sign it. Always the moderate, he proposed a more lenient idea. His 10% plan required 1/10 of a state's voting population to take the oath, entitled the Ironclad Oath. And it reads, I, blank, do solemnly swear or affirm that I have never voluntarily borne arms against the United States since I have been a citizen thereof, that I have voluntarily given no aid, countenance, counsel, or encouragement to persons engaged in armed hostility thereto, that I have neither sought nor accepted nor attempted to exercise the functions of any office whatever under any authority or pretended authority in hostility to the United States, that I have not yielded a voluntary support to any pretended government, authority, power, or constitution within the United States, hostile or inimical. And I do further swear or affirm that, to the best of my knowledge and ability, I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. Now, as this bill language, the radical Republicans plan to require abolition as a term of readmission was rendered moot on January 31, 1865, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The new amendment declared, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, end quote. This, not Lincoln's magical Emancipation Proclamation, is what legally, finally outlawed slavery in the United States. And with that came freedom, but also great ambiguity about the status of these newly freed men and women. The Constitution had never defined citizenship, leaving the new freedmen with no national status, surrounded by an angry and violent white population that had been defeated in part by their former servants. Until this point, whether free slaves could vote, own property, or even if they had rights and had been defined by individual states. Rhode Island had allowed black people to vote since 1842, while Pennsylvania had rescinded its state laws granting black citizens access to the ballot because Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the state's largest city, was becoming majority black. And in the wake of the constitutional amendment, with its sweeping proposition of the illegal nature of slavery, an entirely new discussion needed to be had about these freed men and women. On March 3rd, 1865, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Under the direction of the Secretary of War, the Freedmen's Bureau was intended to last for 1 year and direct such issues of provisions, clothing, and fuel as he may deem needful for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. The Union Army seized the land, and the Freedmen's Bureau set up their South Carolina office at a plantation just outside of Charleston at the intersection of the Ashley River, Wapoo Creek, and the Stono River, all on the McLeod plantation. As Lincoln was struggling to come up with a plan for how to discipline the unpatriotic white Southerners, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General William Sherman met with 20 black ministers in Savannah, Georgia, to discuss the fate of the emancipated Americans. The main spokesman, 67-year-old Garrison Frazier, had one request, quote, to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor, end quote. Of the 20 black leaders, all but one confessed that their deepest desire was to live separate from whites. Armed with the Freedmen's Bureau's language, that gave him the authority to set apart, for the use of loyal refugees and freedmen, such tracts of land within the insurrectionary states as shall have been abandoned, acquired title by confiscation or trade, or sale, or otherwise. In January 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman, commander of the military division of the Mississippi, issued Special Field Orders number 15. The military directive commandeered over 400,000 acres of land in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, and proclaimed that, quote, no white person whatsoever, end quote, would be permitted to reside on the lands, adding that, quote, the sole and exclusive management of affairs will be left to the free people themselves, subject only to the United States military authority and the acts of Congress, end quote. With the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, Black America had seized the opportunity to fulfill the dreams they had imagined. With respect to Charleston, South Carolina, Sherman's order specified that parcels of land would be given to the men and women who had been enslaved. The islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Charles River in Florida are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. This was of special significance in Charleston County, where 2,880 slaveholders had held 37,290 enslaved Africans, making it the highest county slave total in America. After Robert E. Lee brought the War of White Supremacy to an end by surrendering his troops at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau set about carrying out Sherman's order in Charleston, with Brigadier General Rufus Saxton leading the effort to distribute the land. During the Civil War, Saxton was in charge of recruiting and commanding the Union's black soldiers. Although some assumed that this was an insult to Saxton, they had no idea that he had been raised by a father who was a Unitarian minister and a staunch abolitionist and a feminist. Yes, feminists even existed back then. Saxton started to divide the land into 40-acre plots and gave out land grants to the newly freed black Charlestonians. Freedmen from all over the country flocked to the McLeod plantation, an area that had the added benefit of protection, courtesy of the Massachusetts all-black 55th Regiment, who had turned the plantation into a hospital during the war. When white men tried to visit, they were met by a party of Negroes, 40 in number, who rushed to the landing at the McLeod plantation, armed with guns, and drove them away with threats to kill them if they came to disturb them in their homes again. In 1865, Saxton's officials lined up the formerly enslaved, many of whom had set up tents and temporary shacks at McLeod's. They handed each of the heads of the families a piece of paper and explained that the deeds they had just received meant they now owned the plantation that they had spent their lives building for free. Some rejoiced, while others collapsed in tears. One of the men, America's foremost expert in Sea Island cotton, broke into song. For the first time in his life, William Hardtime Dawson had a home of his own, but this joy did not last. On April 15, 1865, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, leaving Confederate sympathizer Andrew Johnson as president. Johnson was a Southerner, a slave owner, and a Democrat who had been chosen for the vice presidency in the hopes of stopping the South from seceding. As a former senator of the great state of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson repeatedly let his Democratic friends know where he stood on the issue of freedmen. Quote, "As for the Negro, I am for setting him free, but at the same time, I assert that this is a white man's government," end quote. And he said that in a 1964 speech, reiterating his earlier promises of, quote, "a free, intelligent, white constituency instead of a Negro aristocracy," end quote. And this was happening after the war. When Johnson ascended to the presidency, his first course of action was to stop that slaves getting land nonsense. As second in charge of the new Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, Brigadier General Saxon refused to comply with Johnson's orders, writing that the faith of the government is solemnly pledged to these people who have been faithful to it, and we have no right now to dispossess them of their lands. Johnson fired him. Sidebar, does that sound familiar to what we're going through right now? Back to the book. As soon as he became president, Johnson pardoned every Confederate traitor who was willing to swear their allegiance to the United States and gave them back their land. And because Sherman's order was only legal under the War Powers Act, as Commander-in-Chief, Johnson simply rescinded it. On March 7, 1866, the Charleston office of the Bureau informed Charleston's white plantation owners who had been dispossessed of their real estate after becoming official traitors to their country that they could return to their plantations as long as they shared with the former slaves, issuing General Order Number 9. The first part of General Order Number 9 reads as follows. The former owners of land upon the Seas Island will be permitted to return and occupy their lands, or a portion of them, subject to the terms and conditions hereinafter specified. Part 2 of General Order 9. Neither owners of lands nor free people will be allowed to make use of threats against each other or the authorities of the United States, or to do anything to disturb peace on said islands. But all disputes will be referred to Major Cornelius for adjudication. And Part 3 of General Order Number 9. Grants of land made to the freed people in good faith by proper authority or occupied by them will be held as good and valid until changed or modified by a competent authority. But Major Cornelius may set apart and consolidate them contiguous to each other on one portion of the plantation, in such manner as to give the freed people a part possessing average fertility and other advantages. So basically, they gave him, and Andrew Johnson gave them the authority to take him back. In July 1866, Congress agreed to reauthorize the Freedmen's Bureau while stipulating that all the confiscated lands would be returned to the original owners. For nearly 2 years, black people in South Carolina's Low Country actually owned the land on which they had been enslaved. On James Island, America's slave capital, most of the land had been redistributed to the former slaves before it was taken away. But now these freedmen were surrounded by angry Confederates whose land had been taken by black repo men. And in those 2 years, they had all tasted black power. The formerly, black power is the next segment of this. The formerly enslaved knew what it took to sustain themselves in the country they now co-owned. It's not like the black populace suddenly lost the skills they used to build an immense wealth for Southern slave owners. They knew that farming could be profitable, and they were not afraid of the work. They understood that they had previously been forbidden to read because education was an essential component to success. They are aware that wealth came from land ownership. They knew how to gain and maintain power. Some of the formerly enslaved refused to compromise to work for their former masters. Some seized abandoned lands of Civil War soldiers who had died in the war. Others purchased property from the financially strapped former planter class. When President Andrew Johnson restored the land to the former enslavers, some had already earned enough money to move off of the McLeod farm. By 1867, all the white plantation owners of James Island had regained their property, except for the children of William Wallace McLeod. McLeod had died on his way home from the Civil War, and his estate was tied up in legal issues until 1880. Luckily, the formerly enslaved folks of McLeod, including Will and Hartide, had assistance fighting for what was rightfully theirs from the Freedmen's Bureau, which was then under the direction of General Oliver Howard, a Civil War hero. Congress had given Howard almost unlimited authority, including legislative, judicial, and executive power, which he used to help African Americans create institutions they needed to sustain their communities. President Johnson hated Howard for his open allegiance to the equality of black people. The Bureau was building the kind of America he had vowed would never exist when he decided to stay loyal to the Union. But the line was already drawn, because the commander-in-chief can't just undo federal funding. There was nothing the pro-white supremacy president could do about it. Although the Bureau could not undo Johnson's order reinstating Confederate land, Howard had a better idea. He introduced a set of minimum wages for black laborers who still worked on their former owners' property. To further secure their financial independence, he formalized contracts between black workers and their employers. Because of this, Hartine was still able to purchase his own piece of land, and Will was able to get a pension while working as a laborer at the McLeod plantation. They both kept their money in the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which held the savings of approximately 70,000 mostly black depositors in more than 37 locations across 17 states. One of the most significant components of the Freedmen's Bureau was its education initiative, which built more than 1,000 black schools throughout the nation and allocated $400,000 toward the training of their teachers. By the end of 1865, more than 90,000 students attended Freedmen's schools, with an attendance rate eclipsing 80% of the school-aged population. For some reason, the white administrators were astounded by the black pupils' natural thirst for knowledge. General Howard didn't just fund these projects, he empowered black communities, providing the resources for them to build and maintain these institutions themselves. He was intentional about creating a class of black teachers and theologians, essentially seeding the country with churches that would build more schools and educators to fill more vacancies. The Freedmen's Bureau's agents scouted organizations and churches that were already engaged in educating formerly enslaved people and funded their efforts. In conjunction with the American Missionary Association, the Bureau sponsored 24 institutions of higher learning for African Americans, including Fisk University, Clark Atlanta University, and of course, Howard University. In 1869, on the land where they had at one point worshipped in a tent made with tree branches and paper bags, Pappy White and a few of the men and women who were formerly enslaved at the McLeod plantation and the nearby plantations, they christened a platform and began building what is now known as Payne Reformed Methodist Union Episcopal Church. And they did that on Camp Road on James Island. They arranged to purchase the property from the owners of the Seabrook Plantation in 1875, paying $1 a year for 95 years. Pappy White's granddaughter, Ada White Moore, learned how to read at Three Trees Elementary, a three-room school on James Island founded by former slaves. As Payne's Reformed Methodist Union Episcopal Church, he was its researcher and historian. She preserved many of the records that we rely on today. By 1868, Charleston, a city that had thrived on slave trading and slave labor, was now being controlled by its black majority. Africans took their own produce to the market. Workers unionized. Generations were becoming educated. They had financial independence and social mobility, which angered white men even more. And beyond that, Du Bois explained of the white Southerners' fears. If a free, educated black citizen and voter could be brought upon the stage, this would in itself be the worst conceivable thing on earth, worse than shiftless, unprofitable labor, worse than ignorance, worse than crime. It would lead inevitably to a mulatto South and the eventual ruin of all civilization. The worst conceivable thing on earth had actually happened. Because the Confederate States were not represented in the federal legislature, radical Republicans dominated Congress, and on July 9, 1868, another constitutional amendment was ratified. For the first time in American history, the federal government explicitly defined American citizenship, declaring, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. The ex-slaves were not just free. The 14th Amendment constitutionally guaranteed them all the equal protections of the laws previously afforded to white men. Almost 8 months later, the 15th Amendment declared, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Another sidebar. If you and your kids don't learn nothing else, learn the 14th Amendment and teach them the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Teach it. Okay, back to the book. African Americans registered to vote in droves. South Carolina's black voters quickly outnumbered whites. In 1868, the black majority elected Francis Lewis Cardozo as the South Carolina Secretary of State. Howard and the American Missionary Association had sent Cardozo to the state to establish freedmen's schools in South Carolina before he became the first African American to hold a statewide office in the United States. Cardozo High School, that's somebody y'all can look up and write about during Black History Month. Black voters also sent Richard Kane, superintendent of AME missions and pastor of the historical Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, to the South Carolina State Senate. In the State House of Representatives was Union veteran and hero, the notorious Robert Small. By 1870, the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina was black. A black man was on the state Supreme Court, and the State House of Representatives was majority black. 47% were from Charleston, and as soon as they ascended into office, they started exercising black power. A black aristocracy had entered the chat. On March 27, 1869, State Senator Kane created the South Carolina Land Commission to help the freedmen own the property they were farming. Essentially, the state government bought the land, and the black borrowers were only responsible for the interest and the taxes for the first 3 years. If the borrower paid the loan off in 8 years, they received the title. If not, they could still lease the land. In 7 years, 14,000 formerly enslaved African Americans owned land in South Carolina. Benjamin Randolph, another South Carolinian who became one of the first black men to serve as a presidential elector, crowed about his success. He was brave. Randolph eventually helped create the state's first universal public education system while working with the Freedmen's Bureau. And this wasn't just a phenomenon in South Carolina. In Mississippi and Louisiana, black voter registration exceeded 90%. Hiram Rhodes Revels became the first black man to serve in the U.S. Senate, representing Mississippi. In 1872, Louisiana's Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback became the first African American to govern a state. Between 1870 and 1884, 15 black men were elected to the United States House of Representatives, and more than 300 served in state legislatures. Black power was not just limited to politics either. After emancipation, the Southern economy had collapsed. The whites were left to pay off loans and mortgages with literal Confederate money, which was worthless. The collateral that secured their wealth was gone, and the slave economy was no more. Not only had the plantation owners lost their profit margins, but the poor, working class whites had to compete against an increasingly educated population of black Americans. Most slave owners had no plan B and were truly shocked to discover that the men and women who had worked under the constant threat of violence were not about to acquiesce to their white tears. Meanwhile, thousands of Negro soldiers received regular pensions, and others earned money working their land. Black power was real. The workers had organized. Religious and civic institutions were building black middle and upper classes. They controlled the political power base in the cities and the states. There was only one choice for the cowards. They summoned the mob. The next section is entitled Slick with Blood. Building things is hard. Destroying things is easy. After America began to witness what black people could do if they were simply left alone, the reshapers of their own destiny became the target of disgruntled ex-Confederates who regarded the sharing of power as a collective affront to the white race. For them, power was a zero-sum game. White America's continued existence depended on the eradication of black power, and so the destruction began. On July 30, 1866, angered by newly issued provisions that disenfranchised black voters, a group of freedmen, including hundreds of black veterans, gathered on the steps of the Mechanics' Institute in New Orleans to protest during the Louisiana State Constitutional Convention. Expressing their outrage in the blackest way possible, they paraded to assembly with a marching band to show their displeasure with the exclusionary laws that would become known as Black Codes. As they marched, a mob of white supremacists, policemen, and ex Confederates brutally attacked the demonstration until the marchers sought refuge inside the Mechanics Institute, where, as Ron Chernow explained in Grant, I guess Grant is the book, quote, the whites stomped, kicked, and clubbed the black marchers mercilessly. Policemen smashed the Institute's windows and fired into it indiscriminately until the floor grew slick with blood. They emptied their revolvers on the convention delegates who desperately sought to escape. Some leaped from windows and were shot dead when they landed. Those lying wounded on the ground were stabbed repeatedly, their skulls bashed in with brickbats. The sadism was so wanton that men who kneeled and prayed for mercy were killed instantly, while dead bodies were stabbed and mutilated. End quote. The floor grew slick with blood. I've never been able to rinse that phrase from my mind. The carnivorous reaction to black people just existing is a theme that runs throughout American history. As early as 1865, the military commanders and workers with the Freedmen's Bureau began receiving regular reports of murders and outrages committed by whites against freedmen. In the Abbeville district of South Carolina, a quote, desperate and ruffianly character by the name of Reuben Goldberg deliberately and without provocation, as plenty can testify, shot a Negro by the name of A. Peyton, who always bore a good character in the neighborhood and has always been free. End quote. Reformer Benjamin Randolph was allegedly murdered in cold blood by a Klansman. Confederate officer D. Wyatt Aiken, a Klan leader, had called for Randolph's assassination, according to the Freedmen's Bureau officials. Aiken was arrested. He was released 2 days later, and he never faced trial. When they heard about his crime, South Carolina's white community elected him to serve 5 terms in Congress. While many historians describe Reconstruction as a period of, quote, racial unrest, end quote, marked by lynching and, quote, race riots, end quote, it was undoubtedly a war. There were soldiers who wore uniforms, took oaths, and volunteered their service to organize armed units. They had a common enemy and a plan to take them out. The network of terror cells that sprang up during Reconstruction went by many names, including the White League, the White Knights, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the most famous of all, the Circle of Brothers, otherwise known as the Ku Klux Klan. It was insurrection, ethnic cleansing, and terrorism with a little bit of guerrilla warfare mixed in for good measure. To enforce their goals, the loose confederation of historically white fraternities all had one common strategy: killing as many black people as possible and overthrowing the government that had enabled their freedom. In the 1868 election, black citizens exercised their new right to vote and overwhelmingly supported Republican candidate Ulysses S. Grant. In Eutaw, Alabama, black voters catapulted Grant to a 2,000 vote margin in the country. Days before the 1870 midterm election, fearing the power of black voters, Klansmen opened fire at a rally of 2,800 black people, killing at least 4 and causing hundreds to stay home on election day. The Democratic gubernatorial candidate won the county by 43 votes. Ku Klux Klan members in North Carolina assassinated a state senator, murdered a black town commissioner, and lynched so many black voters in 1870 that Governor William Woods Holden declared an insurrection, suspended habeas corpus, and that is the right against unlawful detention, and imposed martial law. But none of the more than 100 terrorists arrested in what would become known as the Kirk-Holden War was ever charged with a crime. This is kind of making me mad. Y'all so bear with me. Holden, however, was removed from office when Democrats gained control of the state legislature after African American voters were forced to choose between voting and their lives. Many of the reports of these atrocities came directly from the Freedmen's Bureau. Even before the war's official end, Bureau officials detailed outrages, warning that white people were getting a little out of control. In describing a, quote, freed boy, end quote, who was dragged about 3 miles with a rope around his neck, residents of Caldwell Parish in Louisiana were told by the sheriff that if they signed a warrant, they would be met by 50 armed men and be killed. The Bureau report ended by noting that many colored people have been and are being killed in the parish on account of political opinions. In Lawrence, South Carolina, 10 or 12 persons were slaughtered the day after the 1870 state elections. A congressional committee investigating Klan violence heard accounts of whites and black ballot casters being waited upon by a white supremacist mob. On Easter Sunday in 1873, the Knights of the White Chameleon, the Klansmen, and the Confederate sympathizers opened fire on black voters in Colfax, Louisiana, burned the victims' bodies, and threw the corpses in a nearby river. No one knows how many people were murdered during this particular incident, but a military report lists 81 black men. Another 15 to 20 bodies were fished out of the Red River, and another 18 were secretly buried. The bloodiest single instance of racial carnage in the Reconstruction era, the Colfax Massacre taught many lessons, writes historian Eric Foner, including the lengths to which some opponents of Reconstruction would go to regain their accustomed authority. The white supremacist terrorism was not confined to violence. Almost every single state of the former Confederacy had begun enshrining black codes in their state constitution in attempts to preserve the social and economic order that existed prior to emancipation. In South Carolina, farm workers were required to work from sunrise to sunset and were mandated by law to refer to their supervisors as masters. The rules undermined the labor contracts instituted by the Freedmen's Bureau and went as far as to forbid any person of color from learning a new trade, declaring, quote, "No person of color shall pursue or practice the art, trade, or business of an artisan, a mechanic, or shopkeeper, or any other trade, employment, or business on his own account and for his own benefit, or in partnership with a white person, as an agent or servant of any persons, until he shall have obtained a license, therefore from the judge of the district court." End quote. Even worse, 9 states passed or updated their vagrancy laws, essentially redefining vagrancy as existing. In Mississippi, a black person was breaking the law if he or she was, quote, found unlawfully assembling themselves together either in the day or at nighttime, end quote. Kentucky filled up its jails by banning, quote, rambling without a job, end quote, or, quote, keeping a disorderly house, end quote. Tennessee laws withheld education from black children by forcing them to work for free as apprentices under their former slave masters. Most often, whites used a combination of violence and technicalities to reclaim political and social status. In the 1866 election, when Georgia black voters elected 3 black state senators and 30 state representatives, deemed the original 33, white supremacists flocked to the Peach State to expel the lawmakers under the new black codes. When the legislators challenged the laws in White versus Clemens, the Georgia Supreme Court rules, quote, after the most careful examination of this question, I am clearly of the opinion that there is no existing law of this state which confers the right upon the colored citizens thereof to hold office, and consequently, that the defendant has no legal right to hold and exercise the duties of the office which he claims under her authority, end quote. For its violence and discrimination against black people, Georgia was placed under military rule again in 1869. Perhaps the most interesting part about the white supremacist tactics is that, in the long run, they still were unable to defeat the black majority without cheating. Heading into the 1876 elections in counties across South Carolina, white supremacist mobs threatened black voters to vote for Democratic gubernatorial candidate Wade Hampton over Republican Governor Daniel Chamberlain. In September 1876, a paramilitary group of 500 white supremacists murdered about 100 black people in Aiken County after threatening them that their only safety from death or whipping lies in signing an agreement pledging to vote the Democratic ticket at the coming election. The Republican votes were somehow disappeared, but the Democratic votes quadrupled. In Edgefield, the vote total exceeded the voting age population by more than 2,000. The election board threw out the suspicious counties' vote totals, which were upheld by a federal court. The Republican presidential candidate won South Carolina, as did the Republican governor. Events in Louisiana and Florida had played out similarly as they had in South Carolina, with voter intimidation and suspicious vote totals throughout the state. In 1877, 15 white men, 5 U.S. senators, 5 representatives, and 5 Supreme Court justices gathered in Washington, D.C. room and decided to give the disputed electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate supported by black voters, essentially making him the president. In exchange, the whites-only room also agreed to a plan that included 3 notable provisions. Provision number 1, removal of troops from the Confederate States. In many places in the South, especially Louisiana and South Carolina, the military presence was the only thing protecting black freedmen from white supremacist violence. Provision number 2, funds to industrialize the South and restore its economy. While this never really happened, it was clearly a nod to the white supremacists who couldn't compete with the black liberals. And provision number 3, the right to handle black people as they wished. The federal government agreed to essentially disregard the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. The right to handle black people as they wish became known as Jim Crow. Across the country, not just in the South, states passed segregation laws and disenfranchised black people en masse. The Compromise of 1877 was the definition of white supremacy. Black voters had given Hayes the presidency, and in exchange, he and his white co-conspirators chose white supremacy over equality. But there were some things they could not undo. By 1900, 42.8% of Charleston County's black residents owned land and produced most of the cotton. Historically, black colleges thrived, civic organizations flourished, and the religious institutions remained. The foundation created during this period of black construction would form the framework for every movement for black liberation going forward. What black people created in the light of freedom could only be undone by trickery and evil. But that is not the lesson of Reconstruction. Every single stereotype that remains about black America was disproven after the Civil War. We were smarter. We worked harder. We were not the violent ones. The criminal enterprise called America is nothing but a self-perpetuating white supremacy machine. The only parts that are good and decent are the ones we shined with our spit. Everyone who calls themselves a citizen is a byproduct of our determination to free ourselves. Due process exists because of us. The founders only said all men are created equal. We, the ones who made this country, we proved it. Still, that is also not the lesson of Reconstruction. The lesson of Reconstruction is us. That we exist and breathe and love and sing and laugh and are still here is not a miracle or a revelation. It is a simple, unignorable fact that we cannot be extinguished. All the evil that the world has ever had to offer has been lobbed in our direction. They enslaved. They brainwashed. They lynched us separately and massacred us by the hundreds. They enslaved us by the boatload and sold our families into pieces. They mined our muscles and our minds for their profit and built an empire from it. And when we did the same without their help, they set it on fire. This is America, a floor slick with blood. But that is not who we are. All right, I'll revisit another day, the next chapter, chapter 9. But that's the end of chapter 8. Again, if you don't have another book in your library, well, you should have Nixon's Piano in your library. You absolutely should. Because it talks about 1901. Was that Teddy Roosevelt? He was working with slaves states. The slave states, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, to re-enslave us. And that was in 1901. So anyway, this book needs to be in your library. And I'm putting it online because the internet will be forever. That's what I'm understanding. So, can't find it, go to my YouTube channel. And here's the next book I'm going to read you. Because these are actual testimonies from folks who were enslaved. Okay, this is A21. I'm out.